Good morning, and you're on highly groomed Ben Vision TV. With only a fish that Jack Nicholson could like. Okay, so this morning, or actually yesterday afternoon, but talking to my friend and a colleague. Well, actually, it's a I do a bit of work for a hedge fund banker in London. Very interesting guy, and he very very well connected. And he was talking to me today, ringing me up, talking about another case. In fact, where he lives right is in Madrid at the moment. It's about a block away from where recently one of the president of the Ukraine, who was previously backed by Russia and then disposed of in 2014 in what Western media refers to as a popular uprising. But if you actually go and look at what happened between 2013 to 2014, you basically get Russia offering the Ukraine a very good deal, cheap gas, to basically stay out of the European Union and more significantly NATO. Um, the basically they then had a series of kind of like riots and uprisings, which are referred to as the Maidan Uprising, which then actually led to, I mean, they won the election, but then they got basically disposed of in effectively what was a coup d'etat. And he fled to Russia, and that was, we all know, like, we've heard the U.S. embassy basically admitting that they were behind it. um, is there. And again, like, one of the interesting things, you look at the Radio New Zealand situation was where they fired a reporter, and they didn't fire him because he was doing misinformation, and they fired him because he was telling the other side of the story. And the fact that it's happened in New Zealand, it's just like, oh my God, where have you gone, Radio New Zealand? But anyway, back to the guy I was speaking to. We got on for that. We talked about that, and we started to talk about Russia, and he made a relatively good observation, which is saying that in the situation with Putin at the moment, and this is, it's not a set in line concrete. It's people who are really well educated and know that make their money by knowing the market. He said Putin is he has got to a point where he won't sit down at the peace table, not because he actually had intention of going further west than he did intention initially. But now that he's actually winning the conflict, he's actually looking at certain areas that are deeper into the Ukraine and elsewhere, which do have critical resources, and also some interesting thing, because I made a point to him about, I said, well, why would he go into, we're taking to the next, why would he go into Germany, because it's, got 3.4 trillion in debt, a massive migrant population, which is causing, unemployment, and no critical resources. But as he sort of pointed out to me, like, in these, areas which people have said, oh, there's no critical minerals, there are things like, there's like different muds that are used for industrial purposes, silicon. There's lots of other materials which they do have resources, which is, pretty obvious, really. But he's making the point. He's now saying that when Putin's going, not necessarily going to take over all of Europe, but he is going to push deeper than he initially intended to do, simply because of the fact that he can. And um, he's, the issue here is that, like, he's not going. I don't see him rolling all the way to France. So that's just, it's never happened in history ever that Russia has been that way, for simple reasons of logistics. But it also got me thinking about the conflict from another viewpoint, in terms where, if Putin, especially if Putin is led to believe by the Chinese that he has tentative support, might be inclined to go a bridge too far. And it got me thinking about this situation, because when you look at one of the things I've always turned around and said, try to get through to people's heads that they're just not getting it, going, well, part of the reason why Russia's, pissed off is that they had a lot of their resources, basically public assets, effectively sold at gunpoint, when basically the West pulled out the carpet from underneath Gorbachev and refused to come and give any help during the '93 White House Revolution. And it was like, no, we'll only give you support if you get rid of all forms of idea notions of social leaning reforms, so that something like Denmark or Finland, no, you have to be completely free market. Everything's going to be up for sale, and we won't lend you this money unless we can buy everything that's available, and at 10 cents in the dollar. So the end result is that when you now look at the Ukraine, for example, all the USSR, but the Ukraine situation is that something like 70% of the arable land in the Ukraine is now controlled by foreign companies. Now, what's interesting about this, and it gets me the third player in this risk game that no one's really considering, is that of that 79%, there's the three dominant people who I think own 90% of that 79% is made up of 9 companies that are subsidiaries of BlackRock. So in most of these cases, the companies will be like BlackRock owns 25%, Vanguard owns 25%. So effectively, they have enough between the two of them because they're effectively the same entity that they can effectively control whatever happens on the board of directors. So they don't need the whole 50% because effectively through different, which also avoids things like Chapter 11. It's a really sneaky and clever way to go about it, but that is what it is. So 9 of these, the group that owns 90% of the 70% of the arable land are BlackRock, and then the largest one is actually a state-owned Chinese company. Now, this got me thinking on a whole bunch of levels as well. And again, I'll try to keep to tangent, but the first aspect of it is that historically, when you look at what like the threat of the world, and big picture stuff, was there's this fallacy about Russia's winter makes it impossible to invade it. When the reality is that France and Germany were both doing really well, and it wasn't actually winter to kick them out. The problem, kick their asses. It's the problem they stuck around for too long. If they'd gone into summer, taken X amount of claim, done a careful retreat, not a full retreat, but a tactical retreat, held back, and then pushed forward again the following summer, then they probably could have achieved their goals. But because in both cases of Germany and France, they were too greedy, they wanted it too much, they thought, oh yeah, we can hack out the winter, and that's what actually did them in. And the same in contrast, however, is that give or take the 1300s, so that's the 14th century, give or take 20, 30 years, the situation of a country that actually invaded Russia and succeeded because of winter is actually the situation of the Mongols invading Russia, which is back then. The Russians themselves refer to Genghis's horde as the Tatars, and basically refer to this as like an unknown, known mystery, empire that came out of nowhere. And they did it early on, instead it was like, think of 13, probably about the same time that the Templars got taken out, but about 1309 thereabouts. And they did it, and they just completely kicked the Russians' ass. And that stage, Russia was very much like Italy. It was like not one big massive country, but a consortium of principalities and dukedoms and blah, 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 but on and on it went. So they just kicked their asses. And then they did a tactical withdrawal. So they pulled back, they probed out, found what they wanted to know, pulled back, and then basically they were forgotten about by the Russians for another 12 years while they went back to squabbling amongst each other and having that sort of attitude of like, oh, we're Christians, so the only world that really exists that matters is the Christian world, so we're only looking towards the West. When in reality, 13 years later, the Tatars, the Mongolians, came back and ravaged them, this time with a much bigger armed force, and completely ravaged them and nearly came all the way to the doors of Christianity. And then I think it was the plague that you'd have to go back. I didn't look that page of the history book, but I think it was the plague that actually stopped ultimately the full Mongol quest. Interesting thing to consider again if you think the bigger picture and where we are now. So we fast forward back to the modern day, and so we had the situation where BlackRock is, I've always had this really thing about BlackRock, like, it came up about basically, I think it was around about 2000, early 2000, after 9/11. I'm not sure the exact date because it was one of those things that never heard of it, didn't know anything about it, and then just one day it appeared on my consciousness, and I've always been this thing of where the hell did these money for this all came from, and I've got my own theories about that, but the point is, when you look at, again, the relationship that BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street have China, it's a very peculiar one. And I actually asked AI the question about, no, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself because there's another player here called Van Esk. Now, Van Esk turned up in he's a relatively new player, and they turned up in New York in about 1959. And that's kind of significant because it's his father. Van Esk arrived in New York because his father was part of Royal Dutch Shell, their plans to expand the oil empire at a much big international level. And the timing was significant because it was about 4 years after the New York Accords, which are the Accords which are very significant now because they are the Accords, and I say the New York Accords, I might actually mean the New York Convention, but the significant point is when you look at things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, it's signed under the basis of New York state law in accordance with these conventions. And the significance of that is, again, is that New York's a very interesting place because, unlike the rest of America, the New York state itself is based, its state laws a mixture of Dutch customary laws and commercial laws. So what little things like words like human rights have a completely different meaning under that context than the rest of the United States, which draws their constitutional state laws draw on Magna Carta. So the definition of human rights or man and so on is based on that very much that Westminster definition of law, whereas the New York one, no, it's more based on this Dutch commercial area, which very insignificant for international laws. And probably why Royal Dutch Shell started to look at, expanding their businesses into the US and, creating a presence. Because suddenly, when you sign a piece of paper in New York versus when you signed it in Westminster or in London or anywhere else, that they could have a completely, under the conventions, a completely different meaning. But that's neither here nor there, because the key thing is, for our viewpoint, is that when you look at New Zealand, like we backtrack a set, and I'm going to go, first of all, like basically I'm going to concentrate on the Waimea Dam, but I'm pretty much sure if you looked at Cloud Oceans or any of these other models that I'm talking about, it's the same. But Waimea Dam looks like it's the privately owned, looks like it's owned by a whole bunch of shareholders, but it's actually owned by only a very few people. And I noticed that some of them have quite close links to the mining connections, and one of them is actually a lawyer he's done work for Oceana Gold itself. And when I was looking at that situation, because I was looking at basically how the water rights, and I think the mining water rights, we're all missing the point. And again, none of us talk about special economic zones, which, by the time they get implemented will be too late because we will have not been prepared. But, that is what it is. But basically, water and gold work together. And when I started looking at Oceana Gold, working backwards again from my own front door and out to the bigger picture, was, we've got in Golden Bay, we've got the Sam's Creek situation on the back of the Kakaranga National Forest, and a lot of people up in arms about this. And then it turned out that actually Sam's Creek is not actually a New Zealand outfit; it's actually an Australian outfit, and lots more. It's actually partnered up with Oceana Gold. So I went, well, who's Oceana Gold? Which, let's go down that rabbit hole a little bit further. And it suddenly became very, very hard because it's again, like Waimea Dam, looks like there's whole heaps, massive amounts of different owners and share owners. But when you start focusing on the top 25, the ones that have the more than 51% of the ability of, they call the shots, because they basically, the old rule of he with the gold makes the rules. That is the golden rule. When you look at the top 25, the first two biggest players in this, you guessed it, one of them is Van Esk, this New York company, and the other one is BlackRock. Now, I started again thinking a bit further and going, I turned around and I said, looked at the whole structure and turned around and said to AI, AI, is Van Esk actually BlackRock? And it came back saying, well, no, they're very, very similar. And they've got, basically they're involved in the same company. So it's just that same phenomenon. Like you get some, like company X, and it's like 20% owned by BlackRock, 20% owned by State Street, 20% owned by Vanguard. So eventually you've got 60% controlling, but broken up in three ways, so it can't be accused of monopoly. And it also can avoid Chapter 11 and all these other things. So again, this really sneaky asymmetrical warfare on democracy via the corporate system. That they learning from the Microsoft lesson. But anyway, carry on, stick on the point. And the main defining point between Van Esk and BlackRock was basically said was like Van Esk took sort of more conservative, you know, stock options and investment options, whereas BlackRock appeared to be like the kind of a point man and would go in and do all the risky stuff, and of course with great risk comes great profit. So again, instead of having a company that owns 100% share of the situation, you've got 20%, then you can test the waters, and if that works out well and you get a good return, then you can bring the other people into play. So it's again it's a way of very minimizing your risk. But this is where it gets interesting, because when you actually I started looking at who owns Van Esk, and it started to get into basically it had a very strong relationship with state-owned Chinese companies that own a significant portion, or have um, controlling influence is probably a more accurate way of putting it within Van Eske's decisions in the Far East. And again, when you look at the situation of Van Esk and BlackRock in China, these are the only ones. Soros tried to get into it. We were all holding hands. China, Putin, all singing New World Order, kumbaya, kumbaya. Soros going, isn't this wonderful? La la la, tra la 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 la. Until the Chinese wouldn't let Soros in, and then bang, that's it. The Chinese were the big worst scumbags in the world, and suddenly all these leftist organisations that have been all like pro-Chinese suddenly turned on the dime and started actually go, oh no, China's evil, da da da. The hand that feeds you, strikes again. And so, China was suddenly regarded as no longer part of the big friendly club because it wouldn't let Soros do what it do. But it's letting BlackRock into its market, and initially Van Esk was going to do it, but then it sort of pulled back a little bit, and let BlackRock take the lead, and its own efforts went in there at a small scale, but and again it's more targeting the private industry as opposed to these state-owned hedge firms, and that again I'll get into that because that's kind of worthy of a comment too. Um, but basically, the next step is that effectively what's now happening is that BlackRock have been dragged before a congressional inquiry, and they're saying, well, actually, we've got some serious questions to ask you guys, because it looks like you're actually selling weapons to the Chinese, and it actually almost, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but the gist of it was like basically saying, China's really kind of got control of you, and they're using you to undermine our economy. And that's all going to get into things like the buy and investment of gold, because again, that's what my London contact was saying, was that, agreeing with what I've been saying for ages. And I wrote about this at the time when, all the people now that are saying, Putin's a big stinky poo-poo, and he's bad, were the same people that back in, I think it was 2006 I wrote this, and I was talking about the weaponization of gold by China and Russia. This is even before anyone had ever heard about BRICS, and everyone was going, "Oh no, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen," because they were stockpiling gold. And now we're seeing that's this huge push up in gold is because China just can't get enough of it, and the more that they buy, the better the job they're doing. It's destroying the American economy, which is the principal target in all of this, into a certain degree, also the European markets as well. And so pretty much, well, when we start to look at the question is, we're going, well, actually, they're basically saying that BlackRock and Van Esk are agents of and Van Esk by association of, where BlackRock goes, Van Esk goes, are by association, effectively the enemy within. But it's this whole issue again of basically the situation we're going, if Russia goes too far to the west, they will expose themselves to the rear, just like they did back in the 1300s. And that's the area where China's concerned. That's like the backing onto the Russia, or Kazakhstan area, like Tibetan region, which is just chock full of minerals. And like again, I think early on, and probably about 2006ish, the area there was when I was doing Deadline relatively early on in Dunedin. We've got some really good photos that I got sent to me by a contact, and there are these huge, massive 8-lane highways that have been built on all this area that I'm talking about, that are reinforced, so that they can support tanks and heavy infantry. And so again, the West, because we're very Western centric, and we always look about things from our viewpoint, and looking at Taiwan and Taiwan's into the Pacific, and we go, oh my God, China's got its eyes on Taiwan, and they're building all these bridges, and got microglide army of invaders and all these other exotic toys, and China's obliging them by lots of drills and exercise, and everyone's focusing on Tibet, on Taiwan. and no one's really looking at that back area and going, actually, if I was the Russians, I would probably go up there because that's actually what we're all least expecting, which is kind of again the flip side of the World War Two, when Japan entered the war, because there's this whole issue about whether they're going to go into the Pacific or whether they're going to go up into the north, and if they gone into the north, then the whole issue of World War Two could have been completely different. They instead chose to, their bridge too far was going into the Pacific, whereas they said Russia, it's going into the West. But the ultimate outcome basically is that we have, it's a case of going back to the whole, is Putin going to be, made an example like the Russians were in the 1300s? And his threat is the dragon from the east, and it's a yes and a no, because it's Russia probably, I mean, China probably will exploit that area, but it's going to do so with the support of these Western companies, who are the ones that are really largely also driving the European Union leaders, because that was also the point in my London contact. We were kind of going, well, why are all these people in Europe so keen to have a war with Russia when, in this context, they can't really, it's not going to end well for them, it's like, and as far as the idea, like they're talking about conscription, stuff like that, like, good luck. How you might see the modern European person, and that'll be worth a good joke. But the end result is that, yes, we may have all, because we're all looking at it from our Western viewpoint, we may have got it completely bloody wrong, and it's this is the component we need to look at, is the element that our own corporates are actually the real issues, that because they're in bed with China, and people go, oh yeah, they're in bed with, you can almost say, oh, the communist socialist conspiracy. Well, no, it's not, because again, where it gets complicated, and the last part, which I said I was going to add to, was that in China, the dilemma here we also have is that you have a China that needs investment, so it's, it likes the likes of BlackRock and Van Esk and so on, but it also wants to control its oligarchs, which the central part of the CPP feels they're having too much, might, so they've tried to rein them in, which means when they're doing that, they can't be really expansionist China, but they're in this oxymoron where they want the investment, and by defection of wanting the investment, they're going to let these companies in, which will then serve those other Chinese oligarchs. So it's the issue of the element is that what we're really seeing is an homogenation of Western and Eastern oligarchy, or what I'd call a kleptocracy, and that's really, what we're up against is the around the world, and as finally ending to, the punchline is Klaus Schwab turned around and said, he made the statement at the World Economic Forum, at Davos, what I like to refer to as Camp Nancy, because, if you actually look into the history of Davos, it's not a very bunch of nice guys. But he made this point, and again, it kind of rattled off in my head about how history repeats itself. And he said, because of rising energy markets, in other words, petrol is becoming more expensive, and the emergence of new players onto the global scene, and he's meaning here again the emergence of non-state actors. These are corporations that have more wealth, power, and clout than governments, which again our media can't really bend itself. They're not really good at reporting on, because they can understand countries, but they can't understand. It's like you've got people who only understand 2D, 3D chess, and when you introduce, the 3D chess that you might see in the Big Bang Theory, it just does their head, and they can't grasp the fact. But yes, so the new emergence of new players into the field, and he makes a statement, and he says, this will allow us, and I'll finish off on what us is, to be able to divide state actors, meaning Beijing, who has, as I said, that schizophrenic relationship with the oligarchs, and obviously Donald Trump and the Macrons. And so what he means by us is he means the corporate world, the literally the global elite, the people that do own more than $1 billion, at their disposal. And again, there's another structure to this as well, because you've then got things like people talk about the billionaires, the 0.1%ers, but very rarely do you people ever talk about the trillionaires, and these are even bigger than the Rothschilds. These are things like companies like Sercos that, again, it becomes this whole weird world about. What is AI? AI is a self-functioning, self-aware machine that is basically fixed on one singular focus point, to the oblivion of all other ends. Well, that kind of describes modern capitalism. And when you start to get things like Serco, where it's like you could get rid of the CEO tomorrow, it wouldn't make any fucking difference at all because it is the self-replicating and has one purpose, which is more. And that really is kind of really the real thing that we're up against. Board game, the problem we're up against is we want people who want the whole board. And in this age of AI and intelligent machineries, basically the middle class or the working class, if I come redundant, the middle class are soon to be on their way out, so they don't need to be nice to us anymore. They can go right back to the good old days of aristocracy. But I also suspect when we start to look at this whole issue of where this will conclude itself, is ultimately even they are going to make themselves redundant. And that again is because we are so, in that case, the flaw is the humans are like the Russians of old. We're so self-centric on what our viewpoint is, we're not really looking at our rear flank and seeing where the end game is. Anyway, I just sort of share you all this a little bit about this process. And, for the simple for you guys about what we want to take about is I'm basically saying, there's 3 players on this board game, not 2, in fact 4 if you want to include the multinationals. And from New Zealand's viewpoint, the real question we really need to ask ourselves is who is owning the gold? And when we start to even get at things like the big companies like Oceana, who are they?